Thank you.
Hello.
Hello, Maajid. It's great to see you.
This is for everyone here, this is the third time we've shared a stage together. And we were told today that this is going to be a friendly conversation. The only thing we're missing is a fireside here. But I thought I'd kick off with a question, if I may. And that is that it's interesting to me that we met on the opposite sides of a debate. And that was the first time we met. The second time we met, we were on a panel, and it wasn't a debate. And then the third time we met was something special. So I don't know, maybe you want to speak a bit about that, because it's special to me, and I'll add on as you speak. I'll sort of add some anecdotes.
So, Maajid, it's wonderful to see you, and you are giving me the difficult task now of testing our new friendship.
Yes.
The first time we met was opposite one another on a podium known as Intelligence Squared, and the proposition was Islam is a religion of peace. And Maajid was opposing that. And
supporting it.
You were supporting it.
Yes.
Maajid was supporting it. Yeah, Maajid was supporting it. I was opposing it. Good to get that right.
Yes.
And what leads to the third bit, which is much more intimate, is Maajid's wife met him on that night, and that was October 6, 2010. This was before ISIS.
You remember the date? I didn't remember that date.
I do.
Wow.
It was a big deal. I don't do Intelligence Squared every night, so you remember something like that. And I remember it was you and a young woman who looked very modern and was very modern. And we disagreed passionately. And you met there after the event, my friend Sam Harris. And the two of you got so angry at one another that at some point I thought you were going to punch his face. Yeah. Thank goodness you didn't.
Oh, he would have. He's actually a really good martial artist. He would have really beaten me down.
Yeah.
I since learned that he practices mixed martial arts.
Yeah.
So thank goodness I didn't.
So the second time we met was in Richmond, Virginia. I do not remember the date, but what I do remember was really being stunned, because the more you spoke next to us, but with us was an imam, the imam who wanted to build the Ground Zero Mosque in New York. His name is Raif.
Imam Faisal.
Faisal Abdul Rauf. Yeah. Faisal Abdul Rauf. And Faisal Abdul Rauf reminds me in many ways of the villains from Wilkie Collins. I don't know if you've ever read any of those books, but kind of this quiet guy, wears a suit, talks to you the way you want to be spoken to, tells you what you expect, but you can't quite trust him. And of course, I didn't trust the imam, but I was also very cautious of you.
Yeah.
And as the evening went by and you started to say things, I thought, wow, Maajid, you've changed. And that is good. And I think that's the effect of dialogue. And now, and this is the third time we had dinner as friends with Sam Harris, you and Sam have this dialogue going on about Islam. Not as a religion of peace, but Islam as a religion, as a civilization, as a culture that needs reform. And I welcome that. And the more we talk about these things today, and look, I started getting interested in this subject after 9/11/2001, but the more you look at it, the more you see that on the one hand, there's this global level, it's geopolitical. If you look at Syria, the involvement of Iran and Saudi Arabia in Syria, the masses of immigrants coming from that part of the world, how things could really get worse, how Russia is involved, Turkey shoots down a Russian plane. You take all of that and you see the geopolitical consequences of that. It's big, it's macro. But this clash between, and this opposition between, say, Western civilization and Islamic civilization is also something you see in your neighborhood, in the classroom, on the streets. And every time, you go from the global to the micro, and you're confronted with layer after layer after layer of complexity. And I don't know if we can deal with all those layers of complexity in 30 minutes. But we have to be aware as we discuss this and as we analyze it and as we continue to live together that it is extremely complicated.
Yes, and just to fill in some of from my perspective on that, how we met, I agree with you. When we first met, it was more adversarial, and the second time, I think there's something that struck my mind at the Richmond Forum, which is the second time we spoke publicly, and that was that the moderator interjected at one stage and said to Ayaan, but you're an ex-Muslim, you've left the religion, so what right do you have to speak about Islam? Because of course the second one was also called, Is Islam a Religion of War or Peace? Even though it wasn't a debate, it had the same title with the same moderator. You notice he's not here today. So he at that point interjected and asked you, what right do you have to speak? And that angered me. Whatever had happened between those 2 years of our first meeting and our second meeting, I suppose, I'm still on a journey. But that angered me because I interjected and said, hold on, that's unfair of you to say that. Because we, as Muslims, mustn't delegitimize the voices of those who have grown up with our experience, who have grown up in the community, and who have decided, for whatever reason, to criticize the faith. Actually, their existence is a lesson for us, and it's our problem, not their problem, that as Muslims, as Muslim communities, we have to get used to the fact that people will criticize the idea called Islam, which is very different to picking on individual Muslims, which I call anti-Muslim bigotry. I've often said, and in my dialogue that you referred to with Sam, I've said that no idea should ever be above scrutiny. And no people and no person should be beneath dignity. So I then interjected, and I think that probably indicated to you that my own thinking was evolving around this. But there is another meeting which, allow me, I suppose, Ayaan left it to me because it's more personal to me. There's another meeting which was a rather more memorable one for me, at least. I hope you haven't forgotten it. So my wife Rachel is here somewhere. She only attended that first debate to come and see you. She hadn't heard of me. She knew who I was, and actually voted for you in the debate as well. She since assures me that she voted on a technicality, and that was apparently my debating partner wasn't pulling her weight. But that's not for me to judge. But actually, we met only because of that debate, and that led to a relationship which eventually ended in a marriage, and you attended our wedding as a guest. And at the wedding, you also met the Quilliam Reform theologian, Dr. Osama Hassan, who's here in the audience as well. And I think that personalized relationship, for me, is indicative of how I'd like this debate to go if I have a hand in it. And that is that somebody like me, who's come from an Islamist background, who served time in prison for my revolutionary extremist Islamist ideas, and the journey that I've been on, and even when we first met, considering that journey, that we met as adversaries, and Sam Harris as well, to end up at a point where we have developed, I'd like to think, not just an understanding about how we can move this debate forward, but a friendship that is built on that, I think is what I'd like to see replicated across the world when it comes to the way Muslims should not just tolerate ex-Muslims, that's a disgusting way to look at it, but actually offer them, confer to them the utmost respect and civility as human beings who have every right to their opinions and to their right to scrutinize the culture and the faith that they grew up in, as anyone else has the right to scrutinize that. And your last book, I think, is an example of how we can move this debate forward.
And Maajid, it's wonderful, and I think that's a wonderful development in our friendship, in our relationship, and how we can move the dialogue. There is one principle, however, that I think is under threat in the free world, in the Western world, and if that's not defended, then we cannot have this dialogue or any other dialogue in peace. The fact that you have someone protecting you, that I have people protecting me, and that we can't just talk about a set of ideas in the United Kingdom is shameful. It angers me. It makes my blood boil. It is the rule of law. It is freedom of conscience. It's freedom of speech. I had, and I believe I have every right to scrutinize the moral upbringing that my parents gave me. and as an adult, the freedom to leave it if I wish to do so. And they may be angry, they may criticize me, but they have absolutely no right to threaten my life.
Absolutely.
Or threaten yours. So for us in the free Western world, I'm not talking about Muslim majority countries, I'm not talking about the third world, I'm not talking about China, but in free societies where we thought that this was established and taken for granted, there is a threat to the rule of law and a threat to the freedom of speech. And only if we protect that, so we don't give in to either the lobbyists from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation countries who want to criminalize speech. We should not give in to them. We should resist them. We should explain to them why our principles of free speech matter. That's number one. And number two, we should also take every kind of physical threat to an opinion. So that's one way of moving it. And I think that Islam presented to us either by the jihadists, and I'm talking about Islam as a political idea, either presented by the jihadists or presented by these organized at the state level, that both of these threaten the freedom of speech. Iran has just
renewed its fatwa.
The fatwa.
Yeah.
So if in 1989 we had been unequivocal about protecting Salman Rushdie's rights, to write that book, I think we would have been in a better place if we had taken this seriously and we could have seen it coming. And a decade later, we could have seen it coming.
Yeah.
So that is number one. Number two, I think one problem now as the world meets, we live in a world where we are globalizing at a fast pace. And in that, for those of us who live in the West, we're used to framing everything in terms of everything political and cultural, in terms of left and right. And to be quite honest with you, there are things that simply don't fit in there, because that framework of left and right and middle, it is not non-Western, it's only Western. So if you're grappling with the issue of political Islam, jihadism, da'wah, that sort of thing, it just doesn't fit in there. And what happens as a side effect, and maybe intended by the far left, maybe intended by the far right, I don't know. But once you try to squeeze this big global civilizational issue into that very narrow framework of left and right, you are then left with the left calling everyone a racist that don't agree with them. And the right expressing themselves, the far right expressing themselves only in nationalistic terms. And as they continue to do that, as they continue to eat one another, hate one another, this big, enormous tsunami of problems is coming at us, and we're not having the opportunity to discuss that in a way that we are protected.
I call that the triple threat in Europe. I talk about the threat of the populist and the far right. I talk about the threat of Islamism, and I talk about the threat of what I call the regressive left. And we spoke a bit about that before. What I mean by the regressive left, both you and I have fallen prey to their insidious means. And it's a section of the left who, in the name of respecting cultural diversity, in the name of multiculturalism, in the name of political correctness, in the name of anti-racism, in the name of challenging Islamophobia, would prefer, it's almost an authoritarian response, would prefer to silence and shut down debate than offend communities from people that are from minority ethnic backgrounds. And anyone who then, the reason I'm focusing on these guys, by the way, is I've grown up, neo-Nazis have chased me in Essex with hammers and knives and have stabbed my friends. I am used to neo-Nazis not liking me. And of course, I know Islamists intimately. I know they won't like me. I know they consider me a traitor to their cause. What I didn't expect when we first founded Quilliam was that those who pander to universalist rhetoric, talk about human rights and the principles you've just talked about, the importance of free speech, I didn't expect them to turn on you and me the way that they have. And I emphasize a section within the left, so I call them the regressive left, but they've often, in the name of these things, anti-racism, cultural tolerance and diversity, have decided, and I call it the bigotry of low expectations, they have decided to not just tolerate, but champion all forms of bigotry when it comes from minority community contexts in the name of cultural diversity, and silence those who within those minorities are themselves minorities. The minorities within the minority communities, yeah? The ex-Muslims, the feminist Muslims, the liberal Muslims, the minority sects like the Ahmadiyya community. There are a whole bunch of minorities within Muslim minority community contexts who are attempting to challenge the hegemony, but because the regressive left says, what do the Muslims think? And if you're not speaking in that way, well, you're not speaking the way the Muslims are meant to be speaking, so you must be either Islamophobic or racist. I mean, have you been called a racist ever? I have.
Hard time calling me racist. I'm blacker than they are.
Yeah, exactly. Look, there's a reason. I promised you I'd explain to you why I brought...
female, so...
Yeah, absolutely. There's a reason. I promised you I'd explain why I brought a coffee out with me, right? And this is me. Seriously, guys, this is me acting defiant here. Right? The reason is the last time an interview in The Guardian happened, the journalist made the absurd decision to focus on my dress and the fact that I was drinking a coffee to demonstrate that I'm not authentic enough as a Muslim. Right? So just recently in Australia, I promised you I'd explain this. Recently in Australia, I was asked about it. So I made a vow, a bit like Christopher Hitchens never spoke without a whiskey, right? I said, I promise never to be on stage again without a coffee in my hand, just to stick it to them. You know, what were they expecting? That I should be drinking curry sauce and speaking in a different language, right? That's what we're dealing with, seriously. I mean, have you faced any of this?
Oh, I faced and you know, at some point you get used to it and you develop a thick skin.
Yeah.
I faced you know, you are traumatized.
Yeah.
You had a bad childhood, so you have nothing to say of interest on the subject of Islam, even though you're not allowed to leave it, because if you leave it, you're going to be killed. I think it is nonsensical. I think it's a hindrance. I do not like the far left. I do not like the far right. I don't like any extremes. But for those of us who are in the middle, at least assuming that we're all in the middle, I think that if we ignore them, and let them not frame the debate, let them not dictate the debate, we have to settle down and start talking about how it is that the fabric of our own societies is threatened. We talk a lot about minorities. Yes, Muslims in the UK are a minority for now. Muslims in Germany are a minority. Muslims in the US are a minority. But if you take the planet, globe, then Muslims are not a minority. They are 1/5 of humanity. It is a very aggressive religion and civilization. It wants to expand. It's expansionist. It's misogynist. They hate women. Anti-Semitism, we thought was gone forever, but it's back. And all this is pushed very radically with a lot of resources by people I call the Medina Muslims, because they want to replicate what the Prophet Muhammad did in Medina way back. They're very political. We need to get that. And in order not only to get it, but to discuss it openly and to fight it and push back, we need to have a very honest conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, you look at incidents like the one on New Year's Eve in Cologne, Germany, and other German cities, but also in Scandinavia, and in this country also, has been going on for a long time. Little girls, as young as 10 years, have been subjected to rape, were abused, and that is racist, by men who formed gangs who would only prey on white little girls. I don't think they were doing this as a matter of religion. It wasn't their religion, but they were doing it because they come from a culture where women mean nothing, they're chattel. And as this is going on, if the police and the politicians and the social workers, the people who are supposed to protect these young people, we pay taxes so that we can be protected. If they sweep this under the rug, then are we not empowering the regressive left, the far right, and the radical Islamists? And we're not doing this only in the UK. We're doing it all over Europe, and we're doing it in the United States. And yes, once in a while, someone like a Donald Trump pops up and starts to repeat a sentiment that is very angry coming from the population. And if we want to have an intelligent conversation, but all the process, all this time that we could have had this intelligent conversation, we close the doors to that.
Yeah,
and we close it down, and then and what we are left with at some point is just options that are all just not good.
Often people have, the statement you just made about Muslim culture, often people have accused you of generalizing.
Yeah.
So I want to give some statistics of Britain, because we're obviously in London, and I think the stats themselves in survey after survey speak to this truth, which is why my own thinking evolved. When we first met, I was arguing Islam is a religion of peace. I now advocate very openly that it's either neither a religion of peace or war, or both, meaning because it's interpreted in many ways, and so how we judge it today is by how Muslims respond to their scripture today. So some stats, and this is in multiple surveys, we've gauged opinion, not me, but polling companies have gauged opinion of British Muslims. And this is the reason I'm so concerned and why we do what we do. 0% of British Muslims have expressed any sympathy to homosexuality. A third, when polled in a different survey, expressed sympathy to the Charlie Hebdo killings. A third also expressed sympathy for the notion of resurrecting a caliphate. And when we talk about these numbers, it's, give or take a few 0.01% margin of error, 0% expressing no toleration for homosexuality is a serious concern when we have ISIS throwing gays off the top of buildings. A third expressing the notion of romanticizing the resurrection of a caliphate. It should be concerning to us. And even if people often, I mentioned this stat once I was at Aspen, and I mentioned this, and I had somebody on the panel with me who was a Muslim, practicing religious headscarf wearing Muslim woman. And she said, oh, but that's not ISIS caliphate. And I said to her, look, a caliphate is a theocracy, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got a third of the population in America express sympathy for the return of the Crusades, but it's concerning whether it's the ISIS caliphate or not. Any notion of the resurrection of a theocracy in the modern day and age cannot be good for civilization. So when you speak in these terms, I think often people worry that you're generalizing, but actually I'd argue that currently, and the snapshot of time that we can survey at the moment, the statistics demonstrate a worrying trend, a very worrying trend. And what I've often said is that whereas Islamism, that I would define as the desire to impose a version of Islam over society, theocracy, Islamism needs to be intellectually terminated. Islam today, as the religion, requires reform. And so we're dealing with a twin challenge. I don't know if you'd agree, but I think from your last book, it indicates to me that you would. Mm-hmm. We're dealing with a twin challenge of the absolute necessity to completely, totally, civilizationally destroy Islamism, the ideology, and that's the desire to impose a version of Islam on society. But on top of that, the vast majority of Muslims who may not be Islamists, still the understanding of Islam they have, as demonstrated by statistics and polls and surveys, isn't where I'm comfortable with. And that's because, for whatever reason, that reform process, we may be going through it, but it hasn't completed. And I think that one thing I was impressed with in your latest book is your own emphasis on the need to start finding these reformers. You went country to country naming them, didn't you?
Yes.
I mean, she named me in the UK, which is, that's fine. But maybe talk a bit about that.
And Osama Hussein.
Yeah, Osama's here. So, yeah, we mentioned him. Yeah.
Yeah, so the way I see it, it's two different projects. One project is within the House of Islam, and I'm aware from your writings that you don't like the use of the term the House of Islam. Yeah. But this is what the radicals and the Islamists use. They conceive of a House of Islam. They conceive of the inhabitants of that House of Islam as the Ummah. And they want to unite the Ummah to gain this utopian state called the Caliphate. So what happens inside the House of Islam and the project of reformation, that is one project, one subject. The other is what happens in free societies and how they're affected by the Islamists. So when I talk about the rule of law, when I talk about the equality between men and women, gays, fighting anti-Semitism, fighting for the basic principles of democracy and the rule of law, that is a different. I feel as if, yes, there's a very good chance, and I see it much better than I did 5 or 6 years ago, that the House of Islam might be reformed because there's a group of people like you who are coming out and who are asking very basic questions and who hope through critical thinking to reform as in change, as in modify the basic tenets of Islam, and to minimize and maybe marginalize the Medina Muslims, those with an agenda who want to impose Sharia law.
Yeah.
So that's one project, and that is what my last book was about. And then there is how do we preserve our own rights and freedoms and not descend into chaos. So if you take the two together, you would say, leaving aside political correctness, leaving aside the fringes, that we have an interest in supporting the modifiers. So in my book, I do not use the terms radical versus moderate, extreme versus moderate. I prefer, if you read and listen and focus on what the Islamists are telling you, they make this reference, and it's constant, to the Prophet Muhammad and trying to emulate him in the Quran. So if you take the Prophet Muhammad, you see that in the beginning when he was in Mecca, he was preaching. And what he was preaching is what we would define as religion now. When he goes to Medina, he starts to do other things. He starts to wage wars, he legislates, he is judge, jury, general, all at the same time. Now, the people who are Muslim, 1/5 of humanity, who emphasize, when they invoke the Prophet Muhammad, if they emphasize the Mecca period, I label them the Mecca Muslims. The others who invoke Muhammad and emphasize the Medina period and actively set out to Islamize the world through da'wah or mission work or jihad or a combination, I label them the Medina Muslims in that book. And then there's this third group, of which I think you are a member, who want to modify and change. And the enemy are the Medina Muslims. So in this confrontation between the Medina Muslims on the one hand and the modifying Muslims on the other, I think it is in our interest as free societies to side with the modifiers, to empower the modifiers, to expose the agenda of the Medina Muslims in pretty much the way we challenged the ideas of communism, the ideas of National Socialism, because these Medina Muslims promise a utopia that on paper may be appealing to those who are born into Islam, but in reality looks like what ISIS is performing.
Yeah. So on that last note, I just want to perhaps anecdotally mention to everyone here that in 2005 and 4, I was in prison in Egypt, in Mazra'at Tora prison in Cairo, with the who's who of the Islamist and jihadist leadership of Egypt at the time. So this is prior to ISIS creation. But we had the assassins of Sadat, the president of Egypt, was killed in 81. From Tanzim al-Jihad, who were with us in prison. We had Muhammad Badi, who's the leader of the Brotherhood, has since been re-imprisoned in Egypt. The leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Egypt. We had all the various Islamists from Ayman Zawahiri's jihad group through Gama al-Islamiyya, and all the way through to liberal political prisoners such as Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, who's the Egyptian-American sociologist, Democrat. One of the things that shocked me and forced my own thinking is the conversations we used to have in prison with the jihadists and the other Islamists. Because, of course, we grew up glorifying this caliphate that you said on paper looks very attractive to someone born and raised in the Muslim culture. It looked very attractive to me. And we were, no joke, we're in prison before ISIS creation, discussing the intricacies of when the caliphate comes, and these are jihadists talking to me about how it would be perfectly within their rights to enslave women. And this was in 2004 and 5. And so these conversations and this ideology was already in place. It often irks me when people say that I'm a moderate because I criticize ISIS. The definition of moderate is entirely relative. Look, even Al-Qaeda criticizes ISIS, right? Seriously, right? Al-Qaeda is fighting ISIS, yeah? The ideology that laid the principles, the groundwork for this kind of mindset was already there. It's what you've referred to. I call it Islamism. You've referred to it as the Medina period, where
Medina agenda.
People want to impose Islam. It was already there. We were teaching it. We already knew that whenever somebody declares a caliphate, there will be expansionist jihad, there will be enslavement, there will be all sorts of killings and murder. Misogyny, the killing gays off the top of buildings. My former group, Hizb ut-Tahrir, used to publish pamphlets with that. Omar Bakri used to lead the group, right? We used to publish pamphlets with that and mention that hadith and say this would be the punishment for gays in the caliphate, throwing them off the highest building in the city. It's exactly what ISIS is doing. So I have a personal history knowing, and everything ISIS is doing out there, I know we used to teach that stuff. And so it's no good us saying that's not our caliphate. I think the debate has to move, as you're saying, right down to the very notion of a theocracy in this day and age and whether it's good for anyone, or we call it a religiocracy, whatever word we want to use, the idea of imposing a version of Islam over society. And that's I think it's really good that this dialogue, this conversation, is moving in this direction, because you and I think the dividing lines in this debate, I no longer believe, like I used to believe, that what's pejoratively called the new atheists on the one side and Muslims on the other. That's not the dividing line, because actually even on those that we call the regressive left that I've just referred to, you've got atheists among them who defend Islamism, like Glenn Greenwald, defend Islamism to the core, right? There are atheists on that side of the debate as well. And I think that actually you and I think your last book mentions this clearly, you call it the heretics, yeah? The book's called The Heretic. Actually, those who are willing to challenge the status quo in defense of universal human rights, liberal values, and freedoms are on one side of the debate. And then those who defend any form of theocratic or authoritarian ideals in the name of cultural tolerance are on the other side of the debate. And actually, we all have to stand together in solidarity, because your freedoms are my freedoms. Your freedom to leave the religion is my freedom to scrutinize it and reform it. It's one and the same freedom. And I just want to mention a good kind of nice anecdote here, because one of the plus sides to this dialogue with Sam Harris and with Ayaan, and to a lesser extent also with Richard Dawkins that I've been engaged in, is that it's actually had a really positive result for me. I mentioned Omar Bakri Muhammad, who used to lead Hizb ut-Tahrir in this country. He went off, anyone who knows his history will know, he went off and founded Al-Muhajirun. And Al-Muhajirun is the group that eventually was led by Anjem Choudhury in this country, which eventually morphed into the banned terrorist group Sharia for UK, which had franchised by then across Europe and into Australia, Sharia for Belgium, Sharia for Australia, which eventually morphed into ISIS. And almost all of the British foreign fighters who had gone to join ISIS had interactions with this offshoot of Al-Muhajirun, this manifestation of Omar Bakri's group in this country. And ISIS caliphate is all inspired by these sorts of ideas. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that one of the, for me, it really touched me, is that one of the good pieces of feedback I got after these sorts of dialogues that we've started, that Sam Harris and I have, that you and I have, is that there was a former member of Al-Muhajirun, i.e. a banned terrorist organization, who used to be with them 10 years ago and has been on his own journey. And he read the dialogue that Sam Harris and I had called Islam and the Future of Tolerance, which focuses on this reform agenda that you've just been speaking of. And the culmination of that is that he has joined Quilliam. He's here today as well. His name's Adam Dean. And he's also working with us on the reform effort, because one thing that struck him when he read that book was, I think he's told me that and he can speak for himself maybe in the Q&A, but that the understanding of Islamism and how we're focusing on this desire to impose Islam as an idea that we call Islamism that must be intellectually terminated, he said to me, crystallized through reading that dialogue, and he was very happy, and he's looking forward to meeting you at the dinner afterwards as well. But he's also been on a long journey. So we're really trying to build up this notion of Muslims who are willing to scrutinize their own tradition, our own tradition, your tradition as well, by the way, yeah? And your culture that you've grown up in as well. You have every right to own that and to debate it. And to push this debate forward in this way that you've just spoken about as well.
Maajid, I'm getting all kinds of hints that we're out of time.
Oh, she's there, yeah.
Yes.
I think we're going to do something a little bit different, have a little bit more time for Q&A. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Yes.
Thank you. And I think it's very greatly appreciated the work that you both do, particularly in combating extremism and anti-Semitism, which I think affects many people in this audience. The question is, in terms of practical terms, the tension between the free speech argument, shining the light of free speech, having free discussions in order to expose extremism, the tension between that and the need to use or to have restrictions on free speech in order to combat extremism. And particularly, I don't know whether you have a view, particularly Ayaan, on the government's prevent strategy, because this is